Hi, Professor Rapetti here again. Today's lecture is on one of the dialogues of Plato called the Euthyphro, 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 youth, if, fro, Euthyphro. Sometimes people have a hard time pronouncing that. Euthyphro was a prophet, holy man, priest in ancient Athens. And he and Socrates have a conversation as both of them are heading into the courthouse about what makes something holy or pious or good or moral or just. Let me share my screen so you can see my slides so that if and when you need to go back to them, they will ring a bell. Yes. So Plato wrote this, but Socrates is the main character along with Euthyphro. But as in so many other Socratic dialogues, Socrates has a debate, discussion, conversation with someone else. Since Socrates is in all of them, the dialogues were named after the other person having the conversation. So pause for a moment and ask yourself, what makes something right, or good, or holy, or moral, or just, or the opposite of those? Okay. So an important thing to mention is that the version of the Euthyphro dialogue that I put in the Dropbox for you to read is one that's free online. And it interprets this Greek term Hosion mostly as holiness or the holy, or what is holy. Most translators of this dialogue translate the word to mean what is pious or piety, the property of being pious. Someone displays piety when they are pious, right? So I prefer piety, also because for years I taught the text from one that translated it as piety. So I'm sticking with piety, but I also have justification for it. Piety has to do with people and actions, not things. A person can be pious so they can perform a pious action like prayer, observing the Sabbath, going on a religious pilgrimage, whatever, going to the temple, church, synagogue. Holy can also refer to people and actions, like a holy mass, a holy man, or the priest blessing the bread and wine is performing a holy action, a sacrament, right? But it can also refer to objects like holy water or holy ground. Mount Sinai is considered holy ground. Mecca is, right? And so on. Whereas this dialogue, however, is only about people and actions. So it's more about piety than holiness. In my opinion, therefore, piety must be the correct translation, right? And when you translate a term, you need to be sensitive to the context for the meaning in the original language and in the language it's being translated into. And we have a principle for interpretation, which applies also to translation, called the principle of charity or charitable interpretation, which says that you should interpret things in the way that makes the most sense out of them for the person who's claiming or stating something. What would they probably mean? And we want to assume that they're rational and that they're making sense, right? So this principle can be used to guide not only interpretation of what somebody says in your own language, but translation from one language to another. Okay. Now, importantly, in terms of this larger context, in Greek ethical thinking at the time, and certainly in Socrates' thinking, there's this doctrine called the unity of the virtues. And what was believed by this doctrine just expresses this belief, that to truly possess virtue, you have to possess them all. And they're all united in wisdom. Right? And wisdom is the judge that decides how much of anything is necessary for it to be the appropriate amount needed for it to be a virtue. Too much or too little of something is no longer a virtue. Right? So that's just one example of a reason for thinking that all the virtues are united. Now, also, so it was thought that a truly virtuous man or truly pious man or woman would also be just and fair and good and kind and generous and forgiving and loyal and truthful and, and so on, right? So it's a kind of holistic thing. The virtues plus this word for righteousness is dikon in the last bullet there, is therefore holistic. A righteous man, a holy man, a good man is all of those things put together, right? So with that interpretation in mind, I'm preferring, this seems to apply to people and their actions more than it does to things. Okay, so I thought I'd mention that. It's important. But what does piety mean in a daily sense, right? Now, we don't really, some of us do, but most of us don't live in a highly religious culture, or at least our families are not. So we might not even ever use the word piety or pious. But hopefully you've heard the term, like a pious Muslim, right? Somebody who observes the halal rules, which are like the kosher rules, goes to mosque regularly for prayer services, prays on a prayer mat 5 times a day, facing Mecca, follows all the rules in the Quran, tries to at least go on one Hajj, one holy pilgrimage to Mecca once in a life, right? There's a pious Hindu, there's a pious Catholic, and so on, right? That's what it normally means. Somebody who's a member of the clergy is clearly an exemplar, a model of piety, right? They spend their lives engaging in pious actions. People who go to church, temple, mosque, synagogue, etc., on a regular basis when they're expected to by their religion are considered pious. People who pray and observe all the other religious rituals and rules are pious. So, in a sense, the everyday or daily life knowledge of what the word piety means is that it refers to people who are religiously observant or devout, a devout Christian, a devout Buddhist, and so on, right? But this dialogue Socrates has with Euthyphro conjures up a whole bunch of questions about the nature of piety, right? And we'll start out by restricting the discussion to piety, even though with this unity of the virtues, a pious individual has to also be a good person, right? And I think in our modern day sensibility, we can differentiate between them. We say, look at those people coming out of church or out of synagogue. They just went in there and they were performing for God or Allah or whoever it is. And now look at the way they're acting outside the temple or the church or the mosque, right? Or they wear the holy garb, but they're nasty, right? That's like a contradiction, because in our modern sensibility, if you really want to be spiritual, you should be a good person too, right? It's hard to separate those two. Right? So that's the first question. Are the pious automatically or even usually moral? Um, Certainly not automatically moral. Whether or not they're usually moral depends, I guess, on what religious community you're referring to, right? Or vice versa. If somebody's a really good person, a morally upright person, a righteous human being, does that make them religiously devout? Not necessarily, which raises the question, do morals really rest on God or on religion? Almost all societies tend to have a history in which their religion gave birth to their morals, right? And by trying to obey the teachings of the religion, they become moral. And that's at least a belief that seems to be almost universal, right? People are worried about raising their kids without religion because they will be raised without morals, right? Dostoevsky raised that question. I believe the way he phrased it was, if there's no God, then anything is possible. And he didn't mean you can achieve anything in life. What he meant is there's no moral restrictions on your behavior. You can be a cannibal, a murderer, whatever, just don't get caught, right? That's the idea. And in fact, many religious people make this argument today that ethics only has the moral force that it has, right? It only seems objective. It only seems valid because there's a God reinforcing it. It's almost like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? If there's no global government enforcing these global moral principles, what are they worth, right? You still have countries invading other countries, right? So similarly, if there's no lawmaker who can enforce the laws are meaningless, right? And God is the ultimate enforcer of the law, right? It's an interesting argument. But moral values are values. Remember axiology, the three main fields of philosophy: study of knowledge, epistemology; study of reality or existence is what? Metaphysics. And axiology is the study of values and value judgments, right? So moral values and religious values are species or types of values. So they are kind of subject to any of the same considerations that all value judgments are subject to, at least those that they all share as values or value judgments, right? So if there's no God, is there still no good reason to be truly moral? Well, if there's no God, could there be nothing in life that was beautiful or ugly or pleasant or painful? Right? I don't know about that. All right. So we're just whetting your appetite. So once again, they meet on the steps of the courthouse. Socrates' reason for being there is that he's on his way in, like we saw in the last lecture, to defend himself, the apology, for those three charges: corrupting the morals of the youth, rejecting the gods, inventing new gods. And Euthyphro says to him in response, yes, the people don't understand prophets like us. And he's referring to, and he might even say something about Socrates' daemon, the divine sign, that he thought he had some kind of spiritual connection to divinity. Euthyphro's reasons for being there. You read this dialogue, which you should. It's really great. To see Socrates in real action. Giving a speech to the jury is one thing, but seeing him engaged in his method of cross-examination, this is a really good sample of it. Right? So Euthyphro is there. He's a priest, but he's there prosecuting his father, who apparently let a servant who killed a slave die while bound under his custody. So Euthyphro's father had some servants and slaves. One of the servants and slaves got into the fight with each other. One killed the other. So Euthyphro's father bound him, put him in a ditch, and went into town to get the authorities. And by the time he came back, maybe he took too long. The guy was dead. Now, Euthyphro, being a priest, I should point out, is trying to do the right thing, deacon, righteousness, right? And in Greek society, Lady Justice is blindfolded with the scales, right? So he's trying to, there's this idea of if you cause a loss, you have to repay it, right? To balance the scales of justice. A. B, as a holy man, any imbalance or inequity or injustice is like a pollution on your family name, right? Not just for a priest, but for anybody. So the idea is that you need to address it and rectify it. And how do you do that? In the courts, right? That's where people did the right thing. Rather than take it to the streets, we take these matters to the courts. So Socrates is confused. Like, is this good or bad, what you're doing to your father? Right? Or what is what you're doing right, Euthyphro? He's originally alarmed, like, it's your own father. You're pressing charges against your father? How can you be sure the gods will see that as pious or holy? You're a holy man. Is that what holy men do? They bring their father to court, try to get their father arrested? And Euthyphro's reply is interesting, right? He says, yes, Socrates, I am doing the right thing because I'm doing what the gods do. Right? The gods punish their own fathers because, Zeus punished Kronos for Kronos' wrongdoing. The gods are subject to the same moral law as humans are, right? So that's the first and one of the principles, right? But there are three specific principles that I've got here on my chart. One is divine precedent. In the legal system, this Latin phrase in parentheses after case law is stare decisis, which means that any decision counts as a precedent and the decision stays, right? And so it becomes part of the law in a sense. That's a simplification, but it's close enough in what we call case law. So when a judge makes a decision in a case, that kind of might be a new case under a certain legislation. Legislation doesn't cover every case, so judges have to make decisions. Does the legislation apply here? Judge makes a decision that becomes part of the interpretation of the law, which itself becomes part of case law based on cases, decisions in cases, right? Decisis, decision, right? So in the legal system, we have that when, lawyers arguing before a judge will say, but Your Honor, Judge so-and-so in Smith versus Jones decided like this, and that's what's going on in this case, right? They appeal to precedent, what preceded this, the precedent, right? So Euthyphro is appealing to divine precedent. Like I said, the Greeks looked to Homer and Hesiod about what the gods did as the examples of what's morally right, right? So if Zeus punished his father for his father's wrongdoing, then punishing your own father is right, right? That's a divine precedent, right? Euthyphro might have been saying, in Zeus versus Kronos, the judge found that was appropriate, right? So he's appealing to divinity. Like I said, the Greeks appeal to Homer and Hesiod, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the theogony, the birth of the gods, so the genealogy of the gods, and so on. Second principle, justice is blind. That's Lady Justice with the blindfold holding the scales. It doesn't matter who you are, balance must be restored. Somebody created an injustice and it needs to be fixed. He stole a pig, he's got to return a pig, or whatever it is, right? So the law applies to all equally, including gods. Even your own father, even if you're a god and your father is a god who created you, right? And the bottom one, these are implied by Euthyphro and Socrates, right? They're not stated. They're implicit, not explicit. Explicit is when you state something out loud. Implicit is when what you state out loud only implies something else, right? Like, for example, if somebody said, anyone who wears Converse sneakers is a fool, right? And you got Converse sneakers on and he said it in front of you, he's implying that you're a fool, although he didn't call you a fool. It's implicit in what he did say, right? Okay, so the final principle by the way, which is an important one, not only in moral reasoning, but in almost all kinds of reasoning, the principle of analogical reasoning, reasoning by way of analogy. When anybody makes an analogy, right, implicit in that analogy is the idea that two cases are alike, so you should view them alike, right? This is cognitive. It has nothing to do with moral judgments, although it can, right? If two legal cases or moral cases are alike, they should be treated alike, right? So that's the principle. Like cases ought to be treated alike. I want to point out right now, many people watching this video believe in what's called relativism or subjectivism, which goes back to the sophists, right? That there's no objective reality. There's no universal truth. It's all relative. You got your views, I got mine. It's cold for you. It's hot for me. It's true for you. It's false for me, right? As if there are no objective or universal reasoning principles. This is one of them. This is universal. Like cases ought to be treated alike. You know, if you and everybody else in the class all got the exact same numeric average for your final, 100, let's just say, and I gave some of you A's and some of you B's and some of you C's and some of you D's, the first thing that you would do when you complain is appeal to this principle. That's not fair because you're not treating similar cases similarly, right? It's a total principle of law and reason. Okay. So once Socrates hears Euthyphro give a clever answer like that, he congratulates Euthyphro, you know, on his knowledge. And unlike Socrates, when the god Apollo complimented him on his wisdom, he didn't let it go to his head, but Euthyphro does immediately. And he says something like, yes, Socrates, I know this and many other fine things about our religion that the common folk don't understand. They don't understand prophets like us. I'm like in your league, Socrates, you know, prophets like us. I know so much, right? And Socrates like, oh, great, Euthyphro, right? You could help me. I'm on my way into court. I'm being charged with not knowing what's pious. I'm being charged with impiety in a sense, right? Rejecting the religion, thinking the wrong ways about the religion, inventing new ideas about religion. I'll be your pupil. Teach me so then I can go in there. I'm embellishing on this a little, but I can go in there and I could say, you know, Euthyphro is a fine representative of our religion, and he just taught me the meaning of piety. And listen, here's how my life is pious, right? So, yeah. So I have all this already. I didn't realize that what I was saying would show up in words. So, but toward the bottom of the slide, everything up until the word okay, right? I already said, right? But yes, he asked Euthyphro to teach him what piety is or holiness. And Euthyphro says, fine. So, okay, tell me, what is piety? And that's the question. I should put that's the first question, right? Because there are many questions here, but it's one of the larger questions. A bigger question, the big question of the dialogue will come later on. And note now, you've got Euthyphro making a statement and then Socrates questioning him about it. All right, you know, you're tossing around this idea that you have religious knowledge of what the gods will consider pious. What is piety, right? And this begins the Socratic method of question and answer and cross-examination, which you will see displayed throughout this dialogue. Okay? So E for Euthyphro and S for Socrates. Euthyphro's first answer is, well, what I was just talking about, Socrates, prosecuting my own father. That's piety. Pardon me. Socrates replies, well, you know, that's really just an example, Euthyphro. I'm asking you about the essence, the form, the nature of piety, right? It's not a definition, but Socrates didn't have the word definition yet. His student Plato's student Aristotle didn't come along and define it yet. But when Aristotle did define it, I believe that he defined it by watching how Socrates managed to get definitions out of people by asking the right kinds of questions, which will become very clear toward the end of the dialogue, right? He says, I need the essence of it, the nature of it, what makes it what it is, not just an example, right? If you give me the form of it, right? And this is a word Plato will run with, as you'll see when we do Plato, right? The form of something. He doesn't mean the shape of it. Means, he's looking for a definition, the essence of it, what makes it what it is, the criterion that makes something pious. So I can tell apart all instances of piety from impiety, right? What's the criterion? What's the standard? What's the definition, right? And RR is me. I say, compare. A mother trying to teach a child language points up and says light, pointing up to a light fixture, right? Now, if this is one of the first words that the child is learning, the child won't know, is the mother just saying, when I point like this, that means light? When I look in that direction, is that what light means? Does it mean look that way or point that way? Or does it mean up? Or does it mean ceiling? Or does it mean the glass cover on the light fixture? Does it mean the light coming out of the fixture? Does it mean the shape of the fixture, right? Pointing to an example doesn't let you know what features of the example are illustrating the thing that's being illustrated, right? So that's not clear. That's number one. These are my criticisms of Euthyphro's first attempted answer to the question, what is piety? And notice I put that E's first answer. It's not his first definition because Socrates is objecting. That's merely an example. It's not a definition. I need a definition. Even though he doesn't have the word, he has the concept, right? So Euthyphro's second answer will be his first definition. So the numbers are not the same. So when you're taking a quiz or a midterm exam for this lecture, keep this number difference in mind or you will get things wrong, okay? Maybe take a note or look at these slides later on, all right? RR, that's me, Rick Rapetti. My second objection is Euthyphro is also engaging in what philosophers call circular reasoning. So this is now an opportunity to learn an important philosophical term, which if we were using a book that I wrote, I'd have the term in bold and it would be in the glossary at the end of the chapter, right? But we're not doing things that way. So, but take note, this is something you need to remember. What is circular reasoning? It's reasoning in a circle, as opposed to reasoning in a linear fashion, which reaches a conclusion, and the conclusion has solid grounds on which it is based, right? Why do you believe that? Because of this. Why do you believe this? Because of that, right? And how do you know that's true? Well, that's obviously true, or it's self-evident, and nobody doubts it, not even you, right? So, okay, your reasoning comes to an end. It doesn't just keep going in a circle, right? So let me give you an example of circular reasoning, a couple of examples. This lecture might go long now because we have a lot of other kind of auxiliary ideas that we see Socrates using that are worth learning, pausing to reflect on and learn about, right? So if somebody, let's say Joe, tells Mary, our friend Pete's suicidal. And Mary says, how do you know? And Joe answers Mary and he says, Pete has a tendency to try to take his life. Now, pay attention. Pete's suicidal, that's the claim. So that's the conclusion. Mary asks for a premise, a justification, some evidence for why Joe is claiming that Pete is suicidal. Joe's evidence is the following premise or claim or grounds or justification or support. Pete has a tendency to try to take his own life. Now, that's circular. Another way of saying what circular is that the conclusion is also being used as a premise for itself, right? Right? It's like proposition P. Well, how do you know P is true? Because P, right? People reason this way. It's like because or something like that. But it's reasoning in a circle because the premise rests, the conclusion rests on the premise, but the premise is the conclusion, right? Reasoning in a circle. Why is the suicidal example circular? Because what does suicidal mean? Someone is suicidal if they have a tendency to try to take their own life, right? Suicidal, right? It's like a disposition, right? A tendency, right? So it's different if you tried once. Maybe that's not a tendency, right? But in any event, suicidal does mean that. So it means the exact same thing as the tendency to try to take one's own life. So synonyms can be substituted in a sentence without any change in meaning. So since they mean the same thing, it's as if the premise and the conclusion are both saying that Pete has a tendency to take his own life. Why? Because Pete has a tendency to take his own life. All right. Now, you might not get this because you might think that, well, maybe Joe knows that Pete has a tendency because he's seen him make attempts on his own life many times. Well, that's different, right? Then his evidence should have been, I have seen Pete try to take his own life on numerous occasions. He's got scars on his wrists. We've got hospital records. I'm friends with his psychologist, so on and so forth, right? Then that would be giving evidence, which is not circular. That's linear, rests on real evidence, okay? Another good example that I like is a little humorous. Two guys go into the bank. They go to the loan officer, Mr. A and Mr. B. And Mr. A says, hi, I'm here for a loan. I'd like to take out a $10,000 loan. And the bank officer says, fine. Do you have any collateral? Like a house that we could retrieve if you don't pay us back, right? So, or some other account, a business, whatever. That's collateral, right? It would be foolish of banks to give you a loan if you have no collateral, right? And so Mr. A says, well, no, I don't have any collateral, but Mr. B will vouch for me, right? If you get somebody to co-sign, they say, oh, good, okay. So the bank loan officer says, Mr. B, what collateral do you have? And he says, I don't have any collateral, but Mr. A will vouch for me. I hope you see we're reasoning in a circle. And my third funny example, was that hysterical or what? My third funny example is two guys two Orthodox Jews who go to the same synagogue, right? They have the same rabbi. And Mr. A and Mr. B. Mr. A says to Mr. B, did you know that our rabbi converses with God? And Mr. B says, how do you know? And Mr. A says, and I'm going to put my fake Jewish accent here, my fake Brooklyn Borough Park Jewish accent, where I lived for a few years. Would anyone who converses with God lie? Right? Now, you might not get that. So you should pause and literally pause your video and think about that. And then come back. Why is that circular? Okay, claim. Our rabbi converses with God. Not just that he talks to God. Anybody could talk to God. You can do that even if there is no God. But converses with God, if true, means that God talks back to you, right? Okay, how do you know? Well, it's not that he answered he answered a question with another question. Because, sometimes you can use a question to imply a statement, right? And that's what he's doing. What statement is he implying? Nobody who converses with God would lie. Now that might be true, that nobody who converses with God would lie. But if he said that, right, maybe sometimes people hide the circularity by asking another question, right? Or by using a synonymous phrase, like we saw with the suicide case. But the question is meant informally to convey the claim that nobody who converses with God would lie, right? If he said that, however, Mr. B would say, well, how do you know that he converses with God? Didn't you just claim that, right? And it means the same thing, right? You're implying that he's someone who converses with God, right? For that to make sense here, it has to be our rabbi converses with God, and therefore he wouldn't lie about it. But how do you know he converses with God? Because anyone who converses with God wouldn't lie about it. Right, but that presupposes that he converses with God for that to be a valid explanation. But then we still need evidence that he converses with God. Right now, if Mr. A said, well, I saw him praying out loud, and then I heard a voice answering him. It sounded like God. Okay, that's some evidence, right? But otherwise, the claim at issue, the conclusion, is somehow or another smuggling in, using, appealing to, or presupposing itself as a reason for it. That's circular reasoning. All right. So why is Euthyphro's example circular reasoning? Because Socrates is like, how do you know doing that is pious? Right? That's the question. How do you know what you're doing is pious? And then he says, because this is pious. What I'm doing now, prosecuting my father, that's what piety is, right? No, that's what's in question, right? So it kind of begs the question, which is another way. I have that in parentheses, the last thing on the page. Circular reasoning is reasoning that begs the question. This is a phrase that means it doesn't answer the question. It kind of presupposes the item at issue in the question, like a beggar. Okay, whether prosecuting his own father is pious, that is the question. Okay, so first answer, remember, not a definition. That's Socrates' objection. Okay. So Euthyphro goes, oh, okay, I got it now. I think you want the criterion? Here it is. What the gods love is pious, and what they hate is impious. I've got little Cupid gods loving each other, what the gods love. So Socrates' reaction at first is, good. This is a candidate definition. Let's examine it. See if it works. See if it's consistent with everything else that we believe. So Socrates asks Euthyphro, do you believe those stories that the poets tell about the gods? You know, that they're at war, they use humans as pawns, kind of like divine soap opera. And Euthyphro says, yeah, of course I do. And Socrates is like, well, then we have a problem. If some gods love a certain thing, call it X, but other gods hate that same thing, X, that leads to a contradiction. And a contradiction goes against diction or speech or meaning. Logos means word. Logic is reasoning about the meanings of words, right? A contradiction claims that something both is and is not the case. That's what a contradiction is. It doesn't come right out and say that necessarily, but it implies it logically. So if you saw the movie Troy with Brad Pitt playing Achilles, the great warrior, when they take the beach in the city-state of Troy, which is in modern-day Turkey, there's a temple of Apollo right there. And outside the temple, and that's, by the way, where, what's her name, is being held, the woman who started the whole Trojan War, who was part of it anyway. Why can't I think of her name? Helen, Diana, I don't know. It doesn't matter. Memory. There's a statue of the god Apollo right outside the temple of Apollo. And Achilles takes his sword out, cuts the head off the statue, right? So Ares, the god of war, would be very proud. Like, this warrior, he's not even afraid of dissing the gods, right? Attaboy. Whew, love that warrior spirit. Apollo, on the other hand, seeing this happen, This is very impious and disrespectful of you, Achilles. You're in trouble, right? So Ares presumably loves it. Apollo presumably hates it. This is just an example I'm bringing to illustrate the contradiction that Socrates is talking about. If what the gods love is pious and what they hate is impious, or holy versus unholy, then the same thing can be both pious and impious, and that's a contradiction. It goes against meaning. That means that the thing is pious and it's not pious. How could that possibly be? Great movie, by the way. Helen of Troy. Okay. All right. So logical implications. How does this measure up? And what should Euthyphro do about it? So let's think about it. His definition, the first definition, what the gods love is pious, what they hate is impious, together with Euthyphro's polytheistic beliefs about people like Ares, or God people like Ares and Apollo and whatnot, the stories about the gods, his religious beliefs, they lead to a contradiction put together. Contradiction is that X, in this case here, Achilles, is both pious and impious. Can't be. Contradictions are logically impossible, like round squares. They can't be true, right? So if X and Y, two claims, lead to an impossibility, a contradiction, then at least one of them must be false, right? If both can't be true together at the same time, it follows logically that at least one of them must be false, right? Which one? That's Euthyphro over there saying, check or X, which one should I keep, right? Well, think about it. Euthyphro can't drop his religious beliefs because then he'd be accused of being impious like Socrates, right? What option is left for him? His definition must be faulty. So he concedes, yes, I'm afraid so, Socrates. That won't work, right? And he and Socrates both know that Euthyphro is not going to give up his religious beliefs. However, all of you monotheists, those of you who believe in one God, at this point should be keenly aware of the fact that if you don't have more than one God, two or more gods who could disagree, you don't have that problem. So your belief in God and that definition, what God loves is pious and what God hates is impious, seems to work for your religion without any possible contradiction, right? And so you might think, there's one other reason why belief in one God, makes more sense than belief in two or more gods. And Greek polytheism and all the other kinds of polytheism are silly, right? To believe in more than one God. I remember when I went to Catholic school, one of the nuns making an argument like that God is the greatest, most powerful being in the universe. So by logic alone, there can't be two greatest, most powerful beings in the universe because each one would cancel the other one out. I can't be the most powerful if there's somebody as powerful as me, right? So logic alone requires belief in only one God. That's what they claimed anyway. Okay. So this is a kind of humorous little thing. The home here is the philosophy team, and the guest is the religion team. Looks like this is the moral and philosophical implications of this point. Philosophers tend to think that Euthyphro has established in this one example alone that philosophical reasoning defeats religious faith. Philosophers, 1, religious believers, 0. All right, I'm not so sure about that. That's in maybe round 1. Okay, the judges say, who won round 1? Was it Joe Frazier or Muhammad Ali? It was Muhammad Ali. All right, but let's see who wins the fight, right? Now, other religions have similar problems. Can you think? Contradictions with moral principles, And the God or gods of those religions will certainly, if any other religion has a belief in more than one God, they've got the same problem. But even those who believe in one God, right, are monotheists really immune? Well, religious relativism or pluralism is the idea that, well, Christianity is true for Christians, and Judaism is true for Jews, and Islam is true for Muslims, and Buddhism is true for Buddhists, and Hinduism is true for Hindus. And like they all have different conceptions of God, whether it's one God or many gods. But then in the same way that Apollo and Ares in the same religion can have different opinions about the same thing, the God of the Jews and the God of the Muslims and the God of the Christians, right, have different views about the same one thing. So it's as if there are different gods. Well, you could say, well, no, there's only one God and we're arguing about which one is the right one, but it really almost amounts to the same thing, because unless you could prove that your God is the right God, you're like the rabbi, not the rabbi, Mr. A, who's saying, would anyone who converses with God lie? It's like, would anyone who has the true religion be wrong? Right? Well, how do you know you have the true religion? Right? How do you know that your God is the one God? All right. So I don't think monotheisms are immune to this problem. They're certainly not immune to other versions of this problem that we'll see later on in the dialogue. Okay. So Euthyphro realizes his first attempted answer was wrong. And let me go back, by the way. Just want to show you. Second attempt, top of the page, is the first definition. Remember, the first attempt was what I'm doing now, prosecuting my father, Socrates' objection. That was not a definition. Okay, Euthyphro's second attempt to answer the question, what is piety, gives his first definition, okay? So now, after that, we need a reset because the definition doesn't work. Okay, and Socrates actually helps Euthyphro transition to his third attempt and his second definition. Socrates says, well, okay, Euthyphro, let me help you out here. Are there cases that the gods agree on? And Euthyphro says, sure. And Socrates says, for example, the evildoer must be punished, right? That's almost like cases ought to be treated alike, right? If somebody has done wrong, they should be punished. Now, we might disagree about, you think it was his fault, I think it was her fault, we weren't there, it's all hearsay, but whoever did the thing needs to be punished, right? That kind of thing. Right. So now this makes sense, particularly RR bullet 4 and 5, that the Greek gods are limited. They're like superheroes, right? They don't have all superpowers. They have limited superpowers. They're not like God with a capital G who knows everything, right? And the proof of this is Hermes is the messenger god. The gods need a messenger to bring messages to each other. So they don't know everything, right? They're just immortal and they have superpowers like superheroes. Not every superpower, right? God with a capital G has all superpowers. He's all superheroes rolled up into one, right? And then some, right? So it makes sense that the gods, like maybe Apollo wasn't there, Ares was, because, you know, Achilles, his boy, he's watching out for him. So he knows what happened, but Apollo doesn't even know, right? That kind of thing. But Socrates is saying, let's put aside the kinds of things, like human beings argue about things that, you know, because they have disputes about them, they don't really tell us what the truth about that thing is. But those things that we all agree on, let's work with those, right? Maybe it's like that with piety. So Socrates makes this kind of example about the evildoer being punished, and there are things the gods agree on. And so Euthyphro agrees. He says, should we revise your definition accordingly? And Euthyphro says, I don't see why not, right? So RR, Rick Repetti, making my point, third bullet from the bottom, Socrates is now demonstrating his own role as what he calls himself, the midwife of ideas, trying to help other people give birth to their knowledge and their wisdom, right? He helps you through like the push, right? Push that baby out, right? I know you've got some knowledge in there, holy man, about what piety is, and I'm going to help you give birth to it. This also demonstrates what we call in philosophy another important principle, the principle of charitable interpretation, which I mentioned earlier about translating the word hosion, right? You want to put the best spin on what other people say because you're cooperatively searching for the truth together. You're not trying to tear them apart, right? Like the sophists would do. Or if you're in competition with somebody, like a political debate, you try to cut them in half and they try to cut you in half. So if that was going on here, Socrates would now ridicule Euthyphro for being an idiot and contradicting himself, right? And saying, you can't even believe yourself. Nobody could believe in round squares. You just uttered a round square. You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. Get out of here. Talk to the hand, right? No, right? We're searching for the truth together. So I'm going to help you and you're going to help me. We're both trying to figure out what piety is, right? So we are charitable with each other. Okay, you tried that definition, it didn't work. Let me help you. Is this what you mean? Right? Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, I like that. That's better. That's what I was trying to say, Socrates. I didn't get it right, but yeah, that's what I was thinking, right? That's the principle of charitable interpretation. The opposite of that we call straw man. When you purposely misinterpret or misrepresent what somebody else said and put it in a stupider light so that you could then attack it more easily. That's called a straw man, and a straw man is a fallacy. It's a sophistry. It's illogical, right? If that's not what I said, I say something and you go, oh, is this what you mean? Blah, 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 which is some obviously stupid thing that sounds like what I said. Then you could go, that's stupid, and dismiss me, right? Well, you only defeated a straw man, which is a fake man, an imposter, a substitute. You didn't defeat me, right? So this is the contrast between charitable interpretation, which is this competitive search for wisdom together, and straw man, which is not competitive, cooperative, right? Charity, being charitable, generous. Straw man is being stingy and competitive and attacking and using illogic. So it's sophistry, right? They are opposites. And nowadays we have a phrase, when you put the absolute best spin on somebody else's argument, we call that giving them a steel man version of their argument. Strong man, stronger even than the one that he came up with, right? And this is a principle of debate. If you want to really be charitable, put your opponent's argument in the best possible form you could so that your opponent would say, wow, that's an even better version of my own idea than I think I could have formulated, right? And then once you do that, then if you find problems with the steel man, well, if the steel man isn't good enough, then nothing else would be, because that's the best possible version of the argument. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. If you give your opponent's argument a steel man version of it and then show, like, really, it won't work. We tried. Sorry. There's no comeback. But if you do a straw man, or somebody does a straw man of you, the victim of the straw man could say, that's not what I meant. This is what I meant. So there's always a comeback from a straw man. All right. But don't fall for, don't defend yourself against a straw man immediately when someone's using one against you. Identify it as a straw man. You don't have to call it a straw man. All you have to say is, that's not a charitable interpretation of what I said. That's not what I meant. What I meant was this. Okay. So this is the reset. Socrates is helping him. Midwife of ideas, charitable interpretation, Socratic method, all being demonstrated here as part of the reset. Okay, that didn't work. Let's try again. Okay. So here we go with Euthyphro's third attempt. Remember, what's the question that he's attempting to answer? What is piety? First attempt, what I'm doing now, prosecuting my father. That's not a definition. Second attempt is the first definition. What the gods love, right? That didn't work. So now we have a third attempt where he adds the word all. What all the gods love is pious. That's definition 2, but attempt number 3. Remember the difference between those numbers. So here's a funny little picture of all the gods, right? And I said, not just the Greek gods, right? There's Jesus over there and all kinds of Thor and whatnot. Buddha. Well, some Buddhists think Buddha was like a god. In any event, definition 2, what all the gods, we just add the word all to definition 1. What all the gods love is pious, because we talking, right? What was the modification? Those things all the gods agree on, right? So what all the gods love is pious. What they all hate is impious. R is me, and all the rest of them are me speaking here. That's functionally equivalent to monotheism, because if all the gods agree, then you don't have a disagreement. So without the disagreement, there's that contradiction from the first case is avoided, right? But problem, that assumes that the Greek gods are all the gods, right? What if half the gods in the world disagree with the Greeks? Then they're all gods. Then it's like, well, there's no case where all the gods agree, right? So that's a possible problem, right? But for the sake of the argument, let's just restrict it to the Greeks, because that's really who they were talking about. And that's who only Euthyphro believed in. And they didn't live in as much of a multicultural world as we do nowadays. Even though many Greeks knew about the other religions, they thought that they were inferior to them because they didn't speak Greek. They spoke blah, blah, bar. They're barbarians. They're barbarians, blah, blah speakers, right? What is that? Ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Ethnocentrism, my ethnic group is superior to others, or better, or more lovable, or whatever. And xeno means foreigner, phobia, fear of foreigners, right? Looking down, or just, negative attitudes towards others. Okay, so here comes the big question. Let me go back for a moment. Euthyphro just gave the second definition that avoids the contradiction. And Socrates is like, okay, great. Now let's examine that. Let's see if that works. Let's cross-examine it. This method of cross-examination. Okay, new birth attempt. Let's see if it works. Is this baby viable? Socrates, is something pious because the gods love it? Or did they love it because it's pious? That's the big question. Worth sitting down and thinking about for a moment, like the person in the lower right-hand corner. Euthyphro's like, what? He doesn't even get the question. So I point out that even Socrates scholars, historians who specialize in Socrates, don't all agree on what's going on here. And they don't all explain it equally well. One famous philosopher of the 20th century, Anthony Flew, said about this question that it was a litmus test for anyone's philosophical skills, whether or not they even understand the two different options being asked about in this question. Something pious because the gods love it, that's what makes it pious, or they love it because it is pious. Now, I'm just giving verbal emphases to different parts of it to try to get you to understand it, but I'm going to go into it in greater detail, significantly greater detail. Okay, so the question is, what makes something pious? And really, once again, that was the original question, right? Oh, here's an example. Well, what makes that an example of piety? I need to know what that criterion is that makes that example an example of piety, so that I can use that criterion to sort out other cases and examples of pious versus impious, right? What makes something pious, right? Is what makes it the fact that the gods love it? Or does something else make it pious? And because it is pious, that's why the gods love it, because the gods are good and they love good things, right? So Socrates tries to use an analogy, which I call a grammatical analogy. He doesn't use the term, but grammar is the rules that make word combinations sound right, right? In English, we have, what do you call it? We'll say the big house, right? But in Spanish, it's the house big, casa grande, right? Italian too. The exact same three words, la casa grande is the house large, right? But in English, we say the big house, right? So different languages have different rules of grammar ways in which word combinations make sense and ways in which they don't. And if you're fluent in a language and you hear the wrong combination, it violates your grammatical intuitions, right? So Socrates is using grammatical intuitions to try to explain the question, his question, the big question. Is something pious because the gods love it, or do they love it because it's pious, right? It's like kind of grammatically get something wrong. Another example I like to use, which might not work if you use kind of street language, right? I knew somebody who years ago used to say, do you know what time is it? Now, if you have good grammatical intuitions, you know that it should be, do you know what time it is, right? Not, do you know what time is it? And so this is actually one of my cousin's girlfriends. And so he would say, that's not how you say it. Come on. Say it the right way, or something like that. And she would say, what time it is? And that's also wrong, because if you're going to ask the question that way, it should be, what time is it? Right? She got it wrong both ways, even when she tried to fix it, right? And you might, like I said, speaking slang, you might say either of those in a way that's kind of hip and cool and nobody will bother you for it. But in terms of grammar, your English teacher will, right? So this is the idea. So now in grammar, we have an active voice and a passive voice. The active involves a cause and the passive involves something more like an effect, right? So your English teacher might tell you, you should say, he was riding his bike, not his bike was being rode by him, right? Because that makes him riding it seem like the effect or the passive thing, right? The bike itself is passive. The rider is the one performing the action, right? The cause. Okay, so in the left-hand column, you've got, I'm carrying something. In the right-hand column, you've got, it's being carried by me, right? I see something, and therefore it's being seen by me. I love something, and it's being loved by me. These are all examples of the difference between active and passive, or cause and effect. When anything is true in the left column, right, it follows logically that the thing in the right column is true, but the thing in the right column is just an effect of the things in the left column, right? That my bike is being driven by me is necessarily true if I'm riding or driving my bike or my car or whatever it is, right? Not the other way around. I mean, well, it's true that if my bag is being carried by me, it follows logically that I'm carrying my bag. But the direction of explanation always goes from cause to effect. You can infer the cause from the effect sometimes, right? But the cause is what's causing the effect and not the other way around, right? So, like, why are you carrying your bag? Because it's being carried by me? No, that never explains it. And that would be circular also, right? I'm carrying my bag because I've got too many things to carry without something that can hold them all together. I've got, 45 items. I've got pens, I've got Post-its, I've got flash drives, I've got a notepad, I've got books, I've got my cell phone, I got my charger, I got my bubble gum, I got my medications, I got, right? All those things. I only have two hands. I can't carry them all. I don't have enough pockets. So they're in my bag and I need these things today. That's why why do you have a bag? That's why, right? Your mom might have said to you at some point, why are you taking that bag with you? Well, I got a lot of stuff I got to carry, right? Drugs, and I'm just kidding. So, right, the things that are the effects are never the explanation for the causes. The causes explain the effects, not the other way around, right? So something's being loved by the gods. And recall, if you read the dialogue, you know that Euthyphro speaks this way a lot. He says, the god beloved, right? Or what is pleasing, or what is dear to the gods, right? This is like what is loved by the gods, right? X is being loved by the gods, right? He speaks that way, right? And Socrates is trying to say that gets things backwards. Okay, so I said, this is difficult. This is difficult. And even the Socrates scholars working on it have a hard time explaining it. I think my explanation was pretty good. I'm not carrying my bag. Why are you carrying a bag? Because it's being carried by me. Why are you looking at that? Because it's being looked at by me. Why do you love that? Because it's being loved by me, right? No, it doesn't work. It kind of gets things backwards. It's like, okay, look, you might be able to infer the shape of my hand from the shadow that it casts when I'm playing with a flashlight on the wall with the kid at night, and I make certain, right, symbols on the wall, right? If you see the shape of the shadow and you don't see my hand, you could probably infer the shape of my hand, but my hand is causing the shadow, not the other way around. My hand explains the shadow, not the other way around. You, like I said, you could infer something about the shape of the object that casts the shadow from the shape of the shadow, but that doesn't really explain why my hand is doing what it's doing. Because of the shadow? No, it gets things backwards, right? Okay, let's pause. And that's not Socrates' criticism, but now let's look at the theory that he's criticizing. He's implicitly criticizing what's called divine command theory, or DCT for short. Almost every religion has a version of this. It's something like this. A thing, call it X, it's a variable for an action or a person, is pious if that thing is loved by divinity. And I say divinity, and philosophers say divine command theory, to avoid the question of whether or not divinity is single or plural, if there's one God or many gods, because in this case, we're talking about when all the gods agree. So whether there's one of them or a panel of them that all have the same opinion as one would, it's the same thing functionally, right? So this is Euthyphro's claim in his second definition. What all the gods love is pious. What does that mean? Something is pious if it's loved by divinity, right? Okay, now remember the unity of the virtues. This theory, in the religious sense, divine command theory, is applicable to all moral judgments, right? So you could substitute for pious, X is right, or X is good, or X is just, any term that has a positive value, right? Like pious is positive, it's religiously positive. So we get the more abstract formula. Oh, wait, before we go, and we could substitute for loved any attitude that's positive, like God approves it, God prescribes it, God commanded it, right? We're just developing the theory. We're seeing this more complex theory implicit in Euthyphro's second definition, right? By logically analyzing it. This is what later philosophers do, right? They say, look, this is what Euthyphro thinks. He's the first guy in Western society anyway to espouse what later philosophers and theologians will call the divine command theory. Right. And then when you put those two things together, that you could substitute other terms for pious, and you could substitute other terms for loved. What you're substituting for pious is a positive value, pious, right, moral, just, good, right? And you're substituting for loved, which is a positive attitude, any other positive attitude that God has toward a thing by approving it, prescribing it, commanding it, loving it, favoring it, liking it, whatever, right? Permitting it. So then when you make all those substitutions to get the more abstract, almost mathematical or logical formula or definition, here's the formula for divine command theory. An action or person X, whatever it is, has a positive value if God has a positive attitude towards it, right? That's the idea, that God's positive attitude towards a thing is what gives that thing its positive value, okay? And on the flip side, what all the gods hate has a negative value, right? So X has a negative value if God has a negative attitude toward X. Put them together, and that's the complete divine command theory formula. Like I said, this formula is intuitive to many pious people, many religious believers in every religion, and the Ten Commandments come to mind, right? Interestingly, the first 5 are about God. The second 5 are about man. I point that out because this will matter when we get to the third definition, right? But the religious mind is that God said X is wrong, therefore X is wrong, right? God saying that X is wrong is what makes X wrong. Okay, so all of these things, right? Violating them would be wrong, and obeying them would be right, because God has positive or negative attitudes towards whatever he's commanding, he has a positive attitude toward, and what he's forbidding, he has a negative attitude towards. So he loves some things and hates the others. So those things are respectively pious and impious. Okay. So let's play a little game. Let's think about some morally obvious things, right? Like in the lower left-hand corner, giving blood, right? That seems to be a morally good thing to do, right? Of course, assuming that your blood is good, right? If you have a very bad disease that's communicable through blood, then giving blood wouldn't be a good thing, right? Or simply walking as opposed to riding a bike or sitting on a bench. Like there's nothing moral or immoral about going for a walk necessarily. It's a kind of morally neutral thing, right? And that's in the lower middle box. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you've got this stabbing event going on. And well, there might be some cases where stabbing someone is the right thing to do in self-defense or something like that. In this case, we're just imagining an example like killing an innocent person for no good reason, right? That would be something that's morally bad. Now, before I go and give you a list of things that fall into those 3 categories, morally good, morally neutral, and morally bad or immoral. Moral, immoral, and in the middle, I guess it would be amoral, neither moral nor immoral, right? I'm going to give a chart with examples of things that fall into 3 categories. In every case, you could imagine some exception, right? I mean, just turning a light switch on or off is probably morally neutral. But if there's an energy crisis and you turn, you don't shut it off when you should, or if it's unbeknownst to you, it's connected to a bomb, right? I mean, philosophers love coming up with counterexamples. I mean, you see a thing seems a certain way. Well, what if this and what if that? Well, that's correct. And in fact, that's a good skill for philosophers to develop. But in this case, doing that would miss the point. So what I want to do right now is to get you to think about whether or not there are certain kinds of actions that, all things considered, all other things being equal, that's another, those 2 phrases are things that philosophers use to kind of eliminate those kinds of things, right? Like if all things considered and all other things were equal, like there's no bomb attached to that light switch and you don't have AIDS, when you're going to give blood or something like that, right? Leave those kinds of things out and just think of a kind of normal, neutral, or average examples. Are there things, and this is what Socrates is asking, are there things that are morally neutral, morally positive, or morally negative in and of themselves, regardless of whether or not there's a God or gods who like or dislike any of them, right? Just imagine we're in a godless universe. Would it still be good to give blood, healthy blood, or neutral to go for a walk, or bad to kill an innocent person, right? I mean, intuitively, we all know that these things are true. So here's my chart. Oops, wrong way. Obviously moral, obviously neutral, and obviously immoral. So one of the standard things that people think is a kind of nice thing to do is to offer a seat on a bus or the subway to an elderly person, a pregnant woman, someone with a cane or whatever, right? Or to save a drowning baby. Walking through the park, you see a little baby fell over in the kiddie pool and it's floating on its stomach, right? Nobody's watching. The parents are busy chit-chatting. It would be a nice thing to say. It's a morally good thing to do to save the drowning baby. Give blood, we used that example already. the heroic soldier who jumps on the grenade to save all of his friends, right? That's a very noble thing to do. Giving to charities, right? Like I said, you could think of counterexamples, but in the generic sense, these are things that are obviously morally good. And obviously morally neutral is like being left-handed when you write, or right-handed. Years ago, people used to think that left-handed people were witches or something, right? Breathing, like, once again, you could imagine, if there's poison in the air, you shouldn't breathe it. Going for a walk, we did that already. Reading a newspaper, not if it's the Post or the New York Times, right? Once again, leave those ideas out of this. Going to work, right? Having a job, right? It's nothing. It's like morally neutral. Maybe it might be a good thing to do. It depends on the job, right? So just going to work, right? What are you doing? I'm at work. I'll call you back later, right? There's nothing moral or immoral about that per se, right? Now, obviously immoral, killing an innocent person just to appease somebody who wanted you to do it, let's just say, or who told you, like, you want to join the gang? You want to join the mafia? You got to kill your brother-in-law. We don't like him, right? Prove your loyalty to us. Go kill that innocent person, right? Now, this is going to get sick, but when I was a kid living in the projects around Halloween, which is coming soon, we would take eggs and throw them at people, and shaving cream and things like that, make a mess on Halloween. But we would throw eggs at the bus, right? So imagine, throwing babies at the bus because the egg splatters on the big windshield of the bus. The driver gets upset. He tries to chase you, but throwing a baby at the bus and it splatters all over that, like, that would really be something to do on Halloween. No, that would be terrible. That would be evil. That's obviously immoral, right? The rape and murder, well, you can't do it in that order. It should be the rape, the torture, and the murder of an innocent kid, right? That's obviously it. Betraying your friend or your country, your family, whatever. Racism, slavery, we all seem to know that these things are inherently bad, right? So here's the thing. So Socrates' question is now, is what makes those things good or bad the fact that the gods love them and hate them respectively? And the things that are neutral is like the gods could care less about those things? Is that what puts them in the categories that they're in? Or are they already in those categories for other reasons? Right? Are there independent reasons for those things belonging in the categories that they belong in? And the gods recognize that, and that's why they love them or hate them or are indifferent to them. That's Socrates' question. Okay. Now, when you look at it that way, it does kind of look like those things would belong in those categories, whether or not there was a god or gods, or regardless of the god's attitudes towards these things. Right? So Socrates seems to have the lead here. Okay, so another way of putting the problem with divine command theory is that it faces a certain dilemma related to the same reasoning we just went through, but come at a different angle, right? So let me go back. Right? Are those things in the categories that they're in, moral, immoral, or neutral, for independent reasons, or only because God has an attitude toward them, right? So either God has a reason why he loves the things that he loves and hates the things that he hates, or he doesn't. Now, this is just logic. Any claim or its opposite must be true, right? Proposition P, no matter what it is, it's raining out or it's not raining out. If somebody mentions either one of those, the claim is either true or false. If it's true, then it's the one that's true. If it's false, then the opposite of it is the one that's true. It's raining out, it's not raining out. If it's true that it's raining out, then it's false that it's not raining out, and vice versa, right? If it's true that it's not raining out, then it's false that it's raining out. Let's take any claim, and the claim has got to be either true or false. Can't be both, because to claim both is to utter a contradiction. It both is and is not true, right? No matter what the claim is. So either God has a reason for what he loves and hates, or he doesn't. Let's look at either one. A dilemma, dilemma, two branches in Greek, means your position that you're in has two alternatives and both of them are problematic. That's what a dilemma is. Okay. So let's look at this one first. God has no reason for what he loves and hates. Well, if that was the case, then God's loving and hating things would be completely arbitrary, right? God, why are you against the rape, torture, and murder of innocent children? I just am. I could have loved it, but I just chose to hate it, right? That would, like, my decision was completely arbitrary. It's not based on any reason, right? That's the premise that you're entertaining, that I have no reason, right? If that's the case, then God in those 10 commandments could have commanded the opposite of everything he forbid. When he said, thou shalt not, he could have just taken the word not out. Thou shalt commit adultery. Thou shalt commit murder. Thou shalt bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt, the opposite of every commandment, right? If there's no reason, if God had no reason for it, his selecting the one over the other is just like saying, I prefer chocolate over vanilla. I don't like it more. I've just chosen to prefer it. I have no reason. It's not that it tastes better to me, right? I just did, and I'm in charge, right? Yeah, God would it be like the equivalent of a cosmic mafia boss, a cosmic power, total power, no reason whatsoever. Why? Because I said so, right? God could have commanded, every Wednesday you should torture every third innocent child that you meet. Not the first one, not the second one, not the fourth one, not the fifth one, but the third one, that the third child that you meet every Wednesday, you should torture that child, right? Because why? Because my choices are arbitrary. I don't have a reason for them. I don't have to have a reason. I'm God, right? I'm the most powerful being because I said so. That's why, right? Which is circular. But think about it. If God did that, then only the people who tortured the third child that they met every Wednesday would be the pious ones. They would be the high priest and the holy men, right? That doesn't make sense at all. That's absurd. That can't be right, right? The pious would be those who follow whatever the rules are, however, according to divine command theory. X is good if God approves of X or commands it, right? Another problem with this is the doctrine of God's goodness, which is the almost universal religious belief that God, by definition, by nature, is not only good, but the source of all goodness, right? Especially when it comes to the one God. That doctrine becomes empty for logical reasons. According to divine command theory, X is good means X is approved by God. God is good would mean that God is approved of by God, but that's circular, right? Circular reasoning. How do you know God is good? Because God approves of himself. What? Satan also approves of himself. Okay, so look, remember, dilemma. Either God has a reason or he doesn't. Two lemmas, two paths, two branches. We did the first branch. God has no reason. That doesn't work. Now let's look at the second one. Okay, God does have reasons. Let's go back now. God has reasons why he would put those things in the three categories that they're in, just like we have reasons, right? There are independent reasons why doing the things that are obviously moral are obviously moral. There are reasons why, raping, torturing, and murdering innocent children is wrong, right? That are independent reasons that have nothing to do with our attitudes toward them. Those are the reasons why, right? Evil things cause harm and suffering to innocent beings, and good things reduce harm and suffering for innocent beings, right? Those are some reasons. Those are independent reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not there's a God, right? So if there are reasons that God understands or recognizes for why he loves the things that he loves, then the reasons are what make them moral, not the fact that he loves those things. He loves them because they satisfy those reasons, right? They're not good because he loves them. He loves them because they're good, right? So God's attitude is based on good reasons, and those reasons are independent of God's will. They have nothing to do with God's attitude, right? So good reason makes something moral, not God. If that's the case, then divine command theory is false, because divine command theory claims the opposite. It claims that God has no reason, right? God's liking or disliking causes something to be good or evil, according to divine command theory. But reasoning through this dilemma suggests that that won't work. Not having a reason won't work because it makes God arbitrary and the doctrine of his goodness circular. And having a reason won't work only because if it makes sense, then divine command theory is false. It won't work for divine command theory, okay? All right, so let's look at a little summary. This is a little summary of what we just went through, right? It's like a flow chart of logic. Top question, does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it, right? Does he have a reason or not? Okay, on the left, God wills something because it is good. Well, then there's a standard of morality that's greater than God, right? Independent of God's will. On the right-hand side, something is good because God wills it. Well, if that's true, then God can change what's right and wrong at will. And he could order you to torture the third child you see, that sort of thing. Okay. So here we have some biblical examples that are problematic, right? Remember Adam in the Garden of Eden, where God says, you can do whatever you want in the garden, be fruitful and multiply, all that kind of stuff. Eat from all the trees, the fruits of this and that, the tree of life, blah, blah, blah. But don't touch the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Do not eat of it, because on the day that you do, surely you will die. And then Adam goes ahead and does it, right? So now, if divine command theory is true, then God said not to eat the fruit, then that would imply that eating the fruit is bad, right? It follows logically from divine command theory. God said not to do it, so doing it is bad. Adam did it, so Adam is bad, right? That's what the theory claims. Catch 22, right? Does Adam have moral knowledge or not? Now, if Adam has divine command theory in his head, then he knows that obeying God is good and disobeying God is bad. So then he already has moral knowledge. This is a dilemma. Either Adam has moral knowledge or not, just like the other dilemma. Either God has reasons or he doesn't, right? Now, divine command theory, if it's true, right, then Adam would understand divine command theory. Then he would already have moral knowledge. He would know that whatever God says is good. God said that not to do that, so that means that's bad, right? So then he would already have the knowledge of good and evil. But if he already had the knowledge of good and evil, moral knowledge, then there'd be nothing for him to gain by eating the fruit. That makes no sense, right? But if he didn't have the knowledge, right, then he couldn't have understood divine command theory. So he couldn't have known that it's good to obey God and evil to disobey God. So if he didn't know, then he was morally innocent when he did what he did, and God blames him anyway. Right? It's like holding a baby responsible for not realizing when they put their hand in the cake that they're messing up the birthday cake. They just don't know any better, right? If Adam had no clue, then he couldn't have known. It's good to listen to God. It's bad to listen to the serpent. God is good, serpent's bad, right? Without that, so either way, this commandment doesn't make sense. Either he doesn't need the commandment because he's already got the knowledge, or he lacks the knowledge, and therefore he can't even understand the meaning of the commandment, right? But presumably, knowing what's good is knowing what God says is good. That's required, right? For you to be able to be a good person. But then if that's true, then having moral knowledge is good, right? But the commandment implies that having moral knowledge is bad, but you need moral knowledge to know that. So like there's just one problem after another between divine command theory and the Adam and Eve story. Okay, if he has moral knowledge, he's already guilty. He was created guilty if he understands the command. If he doesn't have it, he can't know what's right or wrong, like a little kid, right? Okay, let's get down to Cain and Abel then. God had not forbidden murder yet, verbally, right? Divine command theory says, if God says X is good, that's what makes it good, right? And yet God punishes Cain for killing Abel. That doesn't make sense. Okay, think of Abraham or Ibrahim, right? The great patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, who is praised by all three religions for trusting God above his own moral compass and being willing to kill his own son, an innocent son, not just an innocent person, but his innocent son, just because a more powerful being ordered him to do so, right? This is an evil act, all other things being equal, but he was willing to do it, right? Let's go back and look at that chart just for a moment. It'll take a second. There it is. Obviously immoral. Upper right-hand corner, first example. Killing an innocent person to appease a more powerful being who commands you to do it, right? That's something obviously evil, right? And yet, God commanded Abraham to do it. So if God commands you, according to divine command theory, to do X, then doing X is good. But then God stops him from doing it because doing it would obviously be wrong, right? So if God says X is good, that makes it good. But then God says, don't do X, which implies X is bad. So God kind of contradicts himself before and after this act was about to take place, right? That's problematic, logically speaking. And yet, because Abraham was willing to follow this insane commandment, he and all of his people, his children and their children's children and children, all the way to this day, the chosen people favored by God because of this total act of surrender to God's will, ignoring your own moral compass, trusting, an invisible voice that tells you to kill your son. That's very strange, right? This is problematic from a divine command theory perspective for a number of reasons. Okay, so people who try to defend this example say, well, God was just testing Abraham, right? But God already knew what the result of the test would be, right? Because God knows everything. So that won't work. Sends a bad message, right? If your God tells you to kill somebody, I'm sorry, but we read about this in the newspaper. Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, claimed the voice of a dog told him to do the things that he did. Some people burn their children, boil them, whatever, because the spirit told them. Okay, another problem with this is that all three of those religions, the three main monotheistic religions, praise Abraham for surrendering his moral conscience and his moral reasoning to God, even when it came to his own son. But later on, when it comes to God's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Abraham now argues with God, not on behalf of his own kid, but on behalf of people he doesn't even know, saying to God, it would be wrong of you, it would be immoral of you to destroy a city that had 50 good men. And then 40 good men. He kind of haggles with God. He gets him down to 10 good men, right? Even 10 good men, it would be wrong, right? Even one good man, it would be wrong, right? But Abraham stops at 10. I don't know why. But the point is, in the previous chapter, God rewards Abraham and all of his offspring for surrendering to a crazy command to kill your own son. But then later on, Abraham's telling God what would be wrong on the behalf of other people who aren't even his kid. Why isn't that a problem? Okay, it's just an inconsistency. All right, so look, we're going back and forth. Pros and cons. Those are some objections to divine command theory. Here's some cases where it might make sense. Honor the Sabbath. Remember when I showed you the two sets of 5 commandments? Really, they were on one tablet. But the first 5 had to do with God, and the second 5 had to do with humans. Well, men to God relationships and human to human. Do not kill, don't steal, don't covet your neighbor's wife, honor, no gods before me, keep the Sabbath holy, all those kinds of things, right? Those cases, divine command theory might make sense, right? Why? Sabbath concerns man's relationship to God, right? If I go back to the chart, it's like going to work, right? Going to work one day or the other, it doesn't make a difference. Monday through Sunday, right? You're just going to work. But God says, you know what? On the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week, which is Saturday, right? Technically, I want you to not go to work. I want you to set that day aside to relate to me, right? It's like we're having family dinner every night at 6 o'clock. I want you to be there, right? Parent, God as a parent says, I made you. That's the time for us, right? So he's not converting something immoral, like killing your own son, into something moral, right? He's converting something morally neutral to something moral. Working at a certain time is a morally neutral thing, like reading a newspaper, being left-handed, right? Breathing, walking, and so on. God can designate a neutral act holy, the way a parent tells a kid, I want you to do your homework before you go out and play. There's nothing wrong with playing, right? There's nothing wrong with playing first. But if your parent tells you, I want you to do your homework before you go out, and they care about you, right? Then doing what they say is doing the right thing. They've taken neutral activities like playing and doing homework, right? And given a special value to one of them, right? That transforms it, right? Just like holy water or right? The priest blesses the water or the bread or the wine, and that converts it and makes it kind of sacred, right? So neutral things can be given a positive value or a negative value based on God's attitude toward them in terms of how human beings are supposed to relate to God, either directly or through these other items, right? But can God transform an evil action like killing your innocent son into a moral one? I'm not so sure about that. Socrates and I think, would resist that idea. Okay, right. So there it is. The piety things, the piety rules could work for don't worship other gods because I'm the God. Don't make false idols. That's not how I want you to think of me, through an idol. Don't misuse my name, right? Oh, it's 4, not 5. Keep the Sabbath holy, right? Those things have to do with man's relationship with God. The other ones have to do with how humans treat each other. That's human justice, right? So piety would work if it was restricted to man-God relations, okay? Okay, so let's transition to the 4th and final definition. And once again, this is the principle of charity and the midwife of ideas, trying to help Euthyphro. Okay, I know you've got an idea in there. Let's try another tack, right? Let me ask you a question. Which category is the larger conceptual category, piety or justice? And Euthyphro doesn't get it. And so so Socrates says, okay, let me give you an analogy. Which is the larger category, odd numbers or numbers, right? And obviously, numbers is the larger category because between any 2 numbers, right, like 0 and 10, there are more numbers than there are odd numbers, right? And the number series, the whole thing is like that, right? There are certainly, number is the bigger category, even if there weren't more of them, only because not all numbers are odd, but all odd numbers are numbers, right? So the larger category is the one that includes the smaller category as a subset. Now, Aristotle, I said, defined definition. I think he did it by watching Socrates ask these kinds of questions. Socrates is asking for what Aristotle will later on call the genus. What's the smallest conceptual category that kind of thing belongs to. That tells you what type of thing it is. That's the genus. Aristotle would give a name for this category. The smallest conceptual category that something is like, or that it's a type of, is its genus, right? Right, like mammal and animal. Which one is the genus? Right? Animal is, because all mammals are animals, but not all animals are mammals. So a mammal is a type of animal, right? What about sibling or relative? Which is the genus? Clearly relatives are, because siblings are one kind of relative, but not the only kind. Not all relatives are siblings. Aunts and uncles and nephews and grandparents are not necessarily siblings, right? Okay, so that's, Euthyphro goes, oh, sure, justice is the larger category, right? Justice, righteousness, doing the right thing, right? Piety is a kind of justice, right? And then Socrates asks for the species using Aristotle's claim, like, what part of justice is piety? In other words, how does piety differ from other kinds of justice, right? He's asking for the species, like, what differentiates siblings from other relatives, right? It would be, oh, siblings are children of the same parents. That's the particular type of relative relationship that it is. Oh, mammals are the kind of animal that are warm-blooded and have mammary glands, right? Or odd numbers are numbers that are not equally divisible by 2 without remainder, right? This kind of thing. So Euthyphro gets it, and he says, oh, okay. And it's what we were just looking at on the previous page, right? Those things that have to do with man's relationship with the gods. That part about man's relation to gods. So piety is a man-God justice relationship in which men tend toward the gods, how men treat the gods, right? So here's some relevant justice relationships. How man treats man, and let's go back. That's commandments 5 through 10. They all have to do with how humans treat each other, right? Second one is how God treats man, right? God punishes and rewards mankind for his good or evil deeds. The one in bold is the piety one. That's how human beings treat God, okay? A man-God justice relationship. Which justice relationship? This one, right? How humans treat gods. And God versus God. If there's more than one God, then how the gods treat each other, like Zeus punishing his father, right? Or his father doing other things to other gods that led to him being punished, right? But if there's only one God, row 4 doesn't matter. But with the Greeks, row 4 does matter, right? Okay, so Euthyphro's fourth and final attempt is his third definition. Remember the difference in the numbers. Piety, what is piety? Last attempt. It's a man-God justice relationship in which man tends to the gods, when man treats the gods appropriately or respectfully, right? This is the phraseology that Euthyphro used. He tends to the gods. And Socrates asks for examples, and he's like, all sorts of things. At the bottom of the page, makes offerings and sacrifices, performs prayers and rituals, attends to the temple, the statues in the temple, right? And that he gets all good blessings in return, good harvest, good victory in war, goes to the good place in Hades afterwards, right? So that's the second row, right? When man is good to God in the third row, in the second row, God is good to man in response, Euthyphro's saying. There's a kind of reciprocal thing going on here, right? The things a priest does or a temple servant, those are pious things. Just as with the Sabbath, piety concerns man-God relationships. And I say in my first bullet, this is a perfect Aristotle style or Aristotelian genus-species definition. Okay, I think it is. Socrates didn't think so. So, but of course, what does Socrates normally do? Said, okay, new definition, let's see if it works. Let's test it, let's cross-examine it, Let's expose it to critical scrutiny. Socrates, so you're saying we give to the gods and they give to us in return, right? When we're pious, we get blessings, and when we're impious, we get cursed by the gods, that kind of thing. Is it kind of sort of trade between men and gods? And Euthyphro says, yeah, sort of. Yeah, like that's right. And that is the religious belief, right? The gods are angry at us, lightning and thunder, right? So, okay, do the gods benefit from this exchange? Right? By Zeus, no. Right? Implicit in Euthyphro's answer is that he's got this conception that Socrates would also insist on, that if something is a god, it has to be morally exemplary and morally perfect. It doesn't need anything from us if it's a god, right? So then why would they trade with? They're poor tradesmen. They always get the bad end of the stick. We get everything from them. They get nothing from us. No. Okay, then why do they want us to bother? If they don't get anything from us in the exchange, they exchange with us, but we're not giving them anything that they need, then why do they want us to give them any of this stuff? And Euthyphro says, because it pleases them. Now, if you read the dialogue, you know that Socrates is like, oh, no, not that again. We're back to square one. Isn't that the first silly thing that you said in your first definition? Piety is what pleases the gods, what is loved by the gods, what is dear to the gods. Going in circles, Euthyphro. Back to square one, definition one. Well, let's examine this. In my analysis, Euthyphro was actually right here, and Socrates was wrong. If we were to really completely, I think Socrates failed to give Euthyphro the benefit of the doubt here, the charitable interpretation. He wasn't enough of a midwife here. He missed an opportunity. Socrates loses his footing. This is Repetti's analysis, right? When Euthyphro says, because it pleases the gods, he's not offering a definition. He wasn't being asked for a definition. He was being asked a question, why would the gods want us to treat them a certain way? And he said, because it pleases them. Like they like that. Like, you know, people like to be treated well, and so do the gods. So if people are nice to people, people reward them. And if people are nice to the gods reward them because it's a good gesture. So here's an example from my son. He was about 4 or 5. I forget what it was, some gift-giving event, holiday, Father's Day, birthday, Christmas. I don't remember what it was. He saw me playing cards a lot with my friends at the time, and he took my favorite deck of cards and wrapped them up in wrapping paper and gave them to me as a present. Now, this pleased me, but it didn't benefit me because they were my cards. I don't need anything from him. Yet his gesture alone pleased me. Why did it please me? And this is a really good one, right? Oh, sorry, I have a reminder because I have a meeting coming up soon. So I got to end this soon. This is going on very long. Why did it please me? Because I care about my son, and seeing him trying to approximate the appropriate behavior pleased me because I know that it's a good sign that he's developing in the right direction, right? That was pleasing to me because I care about him. I was happy to see him growing in the right way, right? An ironic little joke about this is he got the better part of the gift-giving principle right. Give people something that you know they like, all right? He got part of it wrong, right? Don't give somebody something they already have, right? But many of us give people things that they don't like, right? Oh, thank you. Yeah, I love it. Is there a return receipt in here? Right? All right, so cute little story. But Socrates, missed the point. Euthyphro was not defining piety. He was explaining why the gods might want us to be pious. It pleases them, right? Same phrase, same sentence could be valid here, but invalid there. Like, it's raining out is true here, but it's not true in Queens. It's true in Brooklyn, but it's false in Queens right now. Like the same statement can be true in some contexts and false in another. Depends on the purpose and the context, right? So he was not offering a definition. He was answering Socrates' question, why would the gods want us to be pious, right? So if I was Socrates, I would have said, okay, it pleases them. We went through this before. Euthyphro, let me ask you another question. Why does it please them? Right? And then Euthyphro, if I was present helping him, I would say, Euthyphro, my son gave me the cards, right? He could say, well, the gods care about us. They're like our parents. So when they see us trying to do the right thing toward them, they know that we are moving towards justice and goodness and holiness. We're trying to be good people. We are approximating the good and the right and righteousness, right? And that pleases them because they care about us. God as analogous with parents, right? That would work, all right? So the dialogue unfortunately ended, but I think Euthyphro's final definition does capture our ordinary pre-philosophical, pre-Socrates universal understanding of piety as a man-God-justice relationship. It's the kind of considerations about how humans should act toward gods or God that's morally appropriate in the man-God relationship. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's true in every religion. All right. The problem is when those attitudes bleed over into the man-to-man justice relationships, right? Those are independently either morally right or morally wrong or morally neutral, independent of God, right? God could take some of the neutrals. That's about it. You can't mess with the morally good and the morally bad. Those are what they are, independently of God's likes and dislikes. That's my view, and that's Socrates' view. Okay, yes, Socrates says, we're going in circles. And Euthyphro says, it's your fault we're going in circles. You're asking me all these questions. And Socrates is like, no, it's your ideas. I'm just trying to help you. Come on, Euthyphro, you're holding out on me. Please teach me. I got to go in there and defend myself. Oh, gee, Socrates. He looks at his sundial watch. Time to go. Kidding. They didn't have sundial watches. Some friend you are, Euthyphro. Once again, a dialogue that ends without a conclusion. That's that word aporia, right? Uncertainty. Morals of the story. And then I got to wrap this up. Sorry it went so long. Philosophical inquiry is often inconclusive. Knowledge requires conceptual clarity and careful logical thinking. If all these Socratic dialogues end in some kind of uncertainty, then maybe we can draw this conclusion that the more we learn, the more carefully we think, the more we realize how little we know. And, just to review, the Socratic method, also called elanchus or elanchus, is just the method of cross-examination. Somebody proposes or makes a claim or proposition that they propose. It leads to a question, which leads to an answer. And then you analyze the answer to see if it makes sense. Does it contradict itself? Does it sit well with everything else that you've claimed? If it's a yes, all positive answers, you've got some knowledge that you've come upon. If not, you could either revise it and try again, like Euthyphro did. He tried 4 different times. Or you could just say that makes no sense and it can't be saved, right? If it can be saved, we use charitable interpretation. We try to come up with a better version of it, as opposed to a straw man, which is to, misrepresent the position so that you could critique it, right? Better to give someone a steel man, give them the best version of their argument and then critique that. There's no comeback after that. But I think the message, I don't think Socrates intended this, but I take this as a takeaway. Don't get so hooked on this method of cross-examination that you're addicted to it, so that no matter, even when the truth and wisdom is presented to you, it's okay to question it at first, but make sure you don't miss your step and miss out on it and overlook your own errors because you just become a skeptic for what, why, like no matter what, there's no good answer for you. Some answers are good, and sometimes explanations come to an end when they've reached a good conclusion for good reasons. That should be enough, but it's often not. So this is just a little cartoon that I would encourage you to go look at when you go back and look at the PowerPoint slides, because we're going to wrap it up now. Let me end this just for a moment. Sorry that this took so long. If it went over 3 hours, I'll make it up next time, I promise. I won't find out how long it was until I'm done, but I'm going to end this now. Hope that was meaningful. Till next time. Ciao.